Rodriguez, right? 30 days for trespassing.
There are a lot of veterans who are still contributing to society without sleeping in the park.
Judge laughs at homeless veteran in court, but has no idea who's about to walk in. The gavel cracked like a rifle shot as Judge Harrison Blackwood dismissed another vagrant with theatrical disdain. 30 days for trespassing, Mr. He paused, squinting at the homeless man in tattered fatigues. Rodriguez, is it? Maybe jail will teach you the value of productive citizenship. The courtroom chuckled at his wit, but the weathered man standing before the bench had earned his right to sleep anywhere through 2 tours in Afghanistan and a Bronze Star gathering dust in a pawn shop. What Judge Blackwood couldn't see beneath the grime and desperation was Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, 3rd Infantry Division, whose steady hands had guided supply convoys through IED-infested highways while politicians slept safely in Washington beds. But the man approaching the courtroom's rear doors had seen those same hands steady a rifle, comfort wounded soldiers, and salute a flag worth dying for. What happened next would remind everyone present that justice isn't always blind, but sometimes it needs better glasses. Municipal Courtroom 3B in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, functioned as society's disposal system for the inconvenient and uncomfortable. Judge Harrison Blackwood, appointed rather than elected, had built his career on efficiency, over empathy, processing the homeless, addicted, and mentally ill like an assembly line of human misery. His courtroom was a theater where justice wore the mask of respectability while criminalizing poverty and punishing survival. The docket this November morning in 2024 was typical public intoxication, trespassing, panhandling, and vagrancy crimes that existed primarily to remove visible poverty from areas where it might disturb proper citizens. Judge Blackwood's approach was swift and merciless: maximum fines for people with no money, jail time for those with no homes, and condescending lectures for those whose only crime was existing in spaces deemed inappropriate by those who'd never missed a meal. Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez had been invisible for 3 years, ever since his discharge from the Army, following an IED blast that left him with traumatic brain injury and PTSD that the VA was still evaluating. His descent from decorated soldier to homeless veteran followed a path worn smooth by thousands before him: medical discharge, benefit delays, inability to hold employment, eviction, and finally, the streets that became both shelter and prison. The tattered uniform he wore was authentic, the same ACUs he'd worn through 2 deployments, now faded and stained with the evidence of sleeping rough. His Bronze Star citation was tucked in his breast pocket next to a discharge paper that listed his injuries as service-connected, but provided no timeline for treatment or benefits. The medals that once represented his value to country now served as identification when police demanded proof he wasn't just another criminal. His crime was simple: sleeping in Lincoln Park after the shelter closed, using cardboard and newspapers to ward off Arizona's surprising desert cold. The trespassing charge was procedural. Police needed something to arrest him for, and existing while homeless wasn't technically illegal yet. His request for a public defender had been denied because trespassing was a misdemeanor, not a felony, leaving him to face Blackwood's justice alone and unprepared. Judge Blackwood embodied institutional indifference disguised as judicial authority. His 20-year career had been built on processing society's unwanted with maximum efficiency and minimum compassion. His contempt for the homeless was philosophical as well as personal. He viewed their condition as moral failure rather than systemic breakdown, individual weakness rather than institutional abandonment. The courtroom's atmosphere was designed to intimidate and humiliate. The judge's elevated bench created physical hierarchy that reinforced psychological dominance, while formal procedures made navigation impossible for those without legal training. The message was clear. This was not a place where justice was sought, but where punishment was dispensed by those who'd never questioned their right to judge others. Miguel's appearance before the bench was choreographed humiliation. His inability to afford proper clothing, legal representation, or even basic hygiene was treated as evidence of moral deficiency, rather than economic desperation. The snickers from court personnel and observers reinforced the social hierarchy that placed housed citizens above homeless veterans regardless of service or sacrifice. The broader context was a justice system that had criminalized homelessness, while defunding mental health services eliminated affordable housing while increasing property values, and abandoned veterans while thanking them for their service. Miguel's case represented thousands of similar prosecutions across America, where survival had become illegal and poverty was treated as personal choice rather than policy failure. But approaching the courtroom was someone who remembered Miguel not as a homeless vagrant, but as the soldier who'd saved his life in Kandahar province, who'd earned his respect through courage under fire, and who deserved better from the country he'd bled to protect. Colonel James Iron Mike Patterson had been searching for Miguel Rodriguez for 6 months, ever since learning that one of his finest NCOs had disappeared into America's veteran homeless population. The trail had led through VA hospitals, homeless shelters, and finally to Phoenix Municipal Court, where a legal aid attorney had mentioned a Bronze Star recipient facing trespassing charges. Patterson's arrival at the courthouse wasn't coincidental. As commanding officer of the 3rd Infantry Division's Veteran Transition Program, he'd made it his mission to locate and assist soldiers who'd fallen through the cracks of an inadequate support system. Miguel's case was personal. The sergeant had saved Patterson's convoy during an ambush in Afghanistan, coordinating medical evacuation while under heavy fire. The colonel's investigation had revealed the systemic failures that had abandoned Miguel to the streets. VA benefits delayed for additional review, disability ratings that ignored traumatic brain injury symptoms, and a healthcare system that treated combat veterans like insurance liability rather than national heroes. The bureaucratic maze was designed to discourage claims rather than provide support. Miguel's condition had deteriorated dramatically since his discharge. The confident NCO who'd commanded respect from enlisted men and officers alike had been reduced to shuffling through courtrooms, apologizing for existing in spaces where his presence made comfortable citizens uncomfortable. His military bearing remained, but it was overlaid with the defensive posture of someone who'd learned to expect rejection rather than recognition. Judge Blackwood's treatment of veterans was notorious among legal aid organizations and veteran advocacy groups. His courtroom had processed hundreds of former service members, each one treated as a criminal rather than a citizen who'd earned consideration through sacrifice. His standard lecture about personal responsibility and productive citizenship revealed his ignorance of combat trauma and systematic abandonment. The colonel's plan was simple but potentially explosive. His appearance in dress blues would force the court to confront the reality that the homeless man they were criminalizing was a decorated combat veteran whose service record exceeded most citizens' contributions to society. The visual impact would be undeniable military authority, challenging judicial power service record, confronting legal judgment. Patterson's preparation had been meticulous. Miguel's complete service record, medical documentation, and evidence of VA system failures were compiled in a folder that would devastate any argument about personal responsibility or moral failure. The sergeant's Bronze Star citation alone would shame anyone who'd spent the war years in air-conditioned offices while young Americans bled in foreign sand. The timing was critical. Patterson had coordinated with Captain Maria Santos, the division's JAG officer, to ensure that his intervention would be legally sound and professionally appropriate. Their goal wasn't to disrupt court proceedings, but to provide context that Judge Blackwood had ignored in his rush to criminalize poverty. Miguel's reaction to seeing his former commander would be crucial. The psychological impact of recognition after years of invisibility could be therapeutic or traumatic, depending on his mental state and the crowd's response. Patterson was prepared for either possibility, understanding that public vindication might be as overwhelming as public humiliation had been. The courtroom's dynamics were about to shift dramatically. Judge Blackwood's comfortable routine of processing society's unwanted would be interrupted by military authority that commanded respect regardless of political position. The collision between civilian judicial power and military moral authority would test everyone's understanding of honor service and justice. Patterson's entrance would transform Miguel from anonymous vagrant to recognized hero, but it would also challenge the entire system that had allowed a Bronze Star recipient to fall through society's safety net. The personal intervention would become institutional indictment. Individual recognition would become systemic accusation. The colonel's greatest challenge would be maintaining military professionalism while confronting civilian indifference that had nearly destroyed one of his best soldiers. His intervention had to be powerful enough to help Miguel, while respectful enough to preserve military-civilian relations that were already strained by veteran issues. As Patterson approached the courtroom doors, he carried not just Miguel's service record, but the authority of every soldier who'd served with honor and deserved better from the country they defended. Judge Blackwood's mockery reached its crescendo as he delivered his standard lecture on personal responsibility to the homeless veteran standing before his bench. "Mr. Rodriguez, your excuses about military service don't excuse criminal behavior. Plenty of veterans manage to contribute to society without sleeping in public parks and panhandling from hard-working citizens." His words dripped with contempt for someone he viewed as a failed citizen exploiting military service for sympathy. Miguel's response was barely audible, his traumatic brain injury making complex speech difficult under stress. "Your Honor, I served my country. I just need help getting back on my feet." The simple dignity of his words was lost on a judge who heard only whining from someone who refused to take personal responsibility for his circumstances. The courtroom's atmosphere grew more toxic as Blackwood's performance attracted approving nods from court personnel who'd learned to mirror their superiors' prejudices. "Military service doesn't entitle you to break the law, Mr. Rodriguez. Perhaps 30 days in jail will help you understand that your service record doesn't exempt you from civic obligations. The escalation began when Miguel's condition deteriorated under stress. His traumatic brain injury symptoms manifested as confusion, slurred speech, and disorientation that Blackwood interpreted as intoxication or disrespect. "Are you drunk, Mr. Rodriguez? Your behavior suggests substance abuse problems that explain your current circumstances." The accusation was devastating and false. Miguel had been sober for 8 months, attending AA meetings at the Veterans Center when he could access transportation. His neurological symptoms were combat-related injuries that the VA had documented but not treated, leaving him vulnerable to misinterpretation by civilians who didn't understand invisible wounds. Court security began moving toward Miguel as his symptoms worsened, interpreting his disorientation as potential violence. The homeless veteran who'd never raised his hand against an American citizen was being treated as a threat by people who'd never faced actual danger. His military training in de-escalation was useless against institutional prejudice that viewed his existence as inherently threatening. The situation escalated when Miguel tried to explain his service record, reaching for the Bronze Star citation in his pocket. Security officers trained to view sudden movements as aggressive moved to restrain him, while Blackwood pounded his gavel for order. "Mr. Rodriguez, any further disruption will result in contempt of court charges in addition to your trespassing violation." The cruelty was systematic and deliberate. Miguel's attempt to provide context for his situation was being criminalized, his military service dismissed as irrelevant to his current legal status. The Bronze Star, that had once represented his value to country, was now treated as worthless paper by a judge who'd never risked anything more dangerous than a difficult legal decision. Miguel's breakdown was quiet and heartbreaking. The soldier who'd faced enemy fire without flinching crumbled under the weight of institutional rejection and judicial cruelty. His shoulders shook with suppressed sobs as he realized that his service meant nothing to people who'd benefited from his sacrifice but refused to acknowledge his worth. The courtroom's reaction was telling. Some observers seemed uncomfortable with Blackwood's treatment of an obviously disabled veteran, but their discomfort didn't translate to action. Others nodded approvingly at the judge's firm hand, with someone they viewed as a criminal exploiting military service for lenient treatment. Judge Blackwood's satisfaction was visible as he prepared to pronounce sentence on someone he viewed as a malingerer and a burden. "Mr. Rodriguez, I sentence you to 30 days in county jail and a fine of $500. Perhaps incarceration will motivate you to seek employment and contribute to society instead of blaming others for your failures." The sentence was cruel and counterproductive. 30 days in jail would cost taxpayers more than temporary housing assistance, while the $500 fine was impossible for someone with no income or resources. The punishment was designed to inflict suffering rather than address problem-satisfying judicial sadism rather than serving public interest. Miguel's final words before sentencing were whispered prayer rather than protest. "God, please help me. I tried to serve with honor. I don't understand why that doesn't matter anymore." The plea was heartbreaking in its simplicity and devastating in its truth, a decorated combat veteran begging for the mercy that a grateful nation had promised but never delivered. The courtroom's collective cruelty reached its peak as Blackwood prepared to conclude the proceedings. The system had functioned exactly as designed, criminalizing homelessness, punishing poverty, and disposing of society's inconvenient members with maximum efficiency and minimum compassion. Miguel Rodriguez would be processed into the correction system like thousands before him, his service record irrelevant to his status as an unwanted burden. But the sound of military boots on courthouse marble was approaching, carried by someone who remembered Miguel not as a homeless criminal, but as a soldier who'd earned respect through blood and courage. The collision between military authority and judicial indifference was seconds away from reshaping everyone's understanding of honor service and justice. The judge's comfortable routine of processing society's unwanted was about to be interrupted by military authority that commanded respect regardless of political position. The colonel approaching his courtroom carried not just individual recognition, but institutional accountability that would challenge every assumption about veterans' homelessness and the meaning of service. The moment of maximum cruelty arrived when Judge Blackwood decided that mere sentencing wasn't sufficient humiliation for the broken veteran before him. Rising from his bench with theatrical authority, he delivered a speech designed to crush Miguel's remaining dignity while entertaining the courtroom audience who'd gathered to witness judicial power in action. "Mr. Rodriguez, you represent everything wrong with modern society people who expect rewards for past performance while refusing to take responsibility for present failures. Your military service, assuming it's even legitimate, ended years ago. Today, you're nothing but a common criminal who thinks a uniform gives him license to break the law." The words hit Miguel like physical blows, each syllable designed to erase his identity as a decorated soldier and replace it with the label of worthless criminal. His Bronze Star citation fell from trembling fingers as neurological symptoms overwhelmed his ability to remain standing. The document that represented his finest moments saving lives under enemy fire scattered across the courthouse floor like worthless trash. Judge Blackwood's satisfaction was visible as he watched the homeless veteran collapse into his chair, broken by institutional rejection that was more devastating than any enemy weapon. Perhaps jail will teach you that playing soldier doesn't entitle you to special treatment in civilian society. Guards, remove this vagrant from my courtroom. The courtroom's atmosphere was toxic, with sanctimonious approval from citizens who'd never risked anything more dangerous than a traffic ticket. Their comfortable superiority was built on ignorance of military service and indifference to veteran suffering, but their judgment felt absolute to someone whose world had been reduced to seeking shelter and avoiding arrest. Miguel's psychological collapse was complete and heartbreaking. The confident NCO who'd commanded convoys through enemy territory was reduced to apologizing for existing in spaces where his presence made housed citizens uncomfortable. His military bearing, maintained through 3 years of homelessness, finally surrendered to the weight of judicial cruelty and social rejection. The crisis deepened when Miguel began experiencing severe neurological symptoms triggered by stress and humiliation. His traumatic brain injury manifested as confusion, disorientation, and slurred speech that Blackwood interpreted as dramatic performance designed to gain sympathy. "Your acting won't work here, Mr. Rodriguez. I've seen this routine before from criminals trying to avoid consequences." The accusation of fraud was devastating because it attacked the legitimacy of Miguel's invisible wounds. His medical documentation was with the VA still under review after 2 years, leaving him unable to prove that his symptoms were combat-related rather than substance-induced. The system that had failed to treat his injuries now provided no protection against accusations of malingering. Security officers moved to restrain Miguel as his condition deteriorated, their training focused on control rather than medical assistance. The veteran who'd survived enemy ambushes was being treated as a threat by people who'd never faced actual violence, his neurological disability interpreted as potential aggression rather than medical emergency. The darkest moment came when Miguel's mind retreated to the battlefield where his identity made sense. In whispered fragments, he began recounting the action that had earned his Bronze Star contact front. 3 casualties, need medical evac, Rodriguez holding position. The combat memories that had haunted his nightmares now provided refuge from civilian cruelty that was more painful than enemy fire. Judge Blackwood's reaction to Miguel's psychological break was purely punitive. "Mr. Rodriguez, your theatrical display is inappropriate for this courtroom. Contempt of court will add 10 days to your sentence." The judge was criminalizing mental health symptoms that he didn't understand and wouldn't acknowledge, treating medical emergency as judicial defiance. The courtroom's collective failure was complete. Mental health professionals weren't present, veteran advocates had no standing, and legal aid attorneys couldn't afford to challenge powerful judges over homeless clients. Miguel was alone in facing institutional cruelty that was both systematic and personal, legal and immoral. The hopelessness was overwhelming as Miguel realized that his service record meant nothing to people who'd benefited from his sacrifice but refused to acknowledge his worth. The Bronze Star that had once represented his value to country was treated as worthless paper by a judge who'd never earned respect through courage or sacrifice. The final blow came when Blackwood ordered Miguel's Bronze Star citation removed from the courtroom as unnecessary disruption. The document that testified to his heroism under fire was being disposed of like litter by someone who viewed military service as irrelevant to civilian judgment. The erasure was symbolic and complete. The homeless man had no past worth remembering, no service worth recognizing, no dignity worth preserving. But as guards moved to escort Miguel to processing for his 30-day sentence, the sound of military boots on marble floors announced that someone was approaching who remembered Staff Sergeant Rodriguez not as a criminal vagrant, but as a soldier who'd earned respect through blood and courage. The reckoning was about to begin. The courthouse doors opened with the authority of military precision as Colonel James Patterson entered in full dress blues, his ribbon rack, telling the story of 3 decades of distinguished service. The immediate impact was electric conversation stopped, heads turned, and even Judge Blackwood paused in his sentencing to assess this new presence in his domain. Patterson's approach to the bench was measured and deliberate, each step carrying the weight of institutional authority that civilian courts rarely encountered. His bearing was impeccable, his uniform immaculate, and his purpose unmistakable. The homeless veteran who'd been dismissed as worthless trash was about to be reclaimed by someone who understood his true value. "Your Honor," Patterson's voice carried across the courtroom with command presence that 3 decades of leadership had perfected, "I request permission to address the court regarding Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, Bronze Star recipient, 3rd Infantry Division." Judge Blackwood's response was defensive and revealing. "Colonel, this is a civilian court proceeding a routine trespassing case. Military rank carries no authority here." His words betrayed nervousness at facing someone whose moral authority exceeded his legal power. Patterson's reply was professionally devastating. "Your Honor, I'm not here to exercise military authority. I'm here as a witness to character and a provider of context that appears to have been ignored in these proceedings." The colonel's folder hit the defense table with a sound that carried the weight of institutional accountability. The transformation was immediate and visible. Miguel, who'd been broken by judicial cruelty, straightened in recognition of his former commander. "Colonel Patterson, sir," he whispered, his voice carrying the automatic respect that military training had ingrained despite years of civilian rejection. Patterson's acknowledgement was both personal and professional. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, good to see you again, soldier." The simple words carried recognition that had been absent from Miguel's life for 3 years. Acknowledgement that he was a person of worth rather than a burden to be discarded. The colonel's presentation to the court was methodical and devastating. Miguel's service record unfolded like evidence in a war crimes trial, 2 tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star for Valor, Purple Heart for wounds received in action, and exemplary service ratings that painted a picture of heroism rather than criminal behavior. Your Honor, on March 15, 2019, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez saved the lives of 4 soldiers, including myself, during an enemy ambush near Kandahar. While under heavy fire, he coordinated medical evacuation and maintained defensive positions until reinforcements arrived. His actions that day exemplified the highest traditions of military service. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted dramatically as civilians confronted the reality that the homeless man they dismissed as a criminal was actually a decorated war hero. The Bronze Star citation that had been scattered across the floor was revealed as testament to courage that few would ever demonstrate. Judge Blackwood's position became untenable as Patterson continued his methodical destruction of the court's assumptions. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's current condition results from traumatic brain injury sustained in combat, compounded by PTSD and institutional failures that have delayed his medical treatment for over 2 years. The medical documentation was overwhelming. VA correspondence acknowledging service-connected disabilities, delayed benefit processing, and systematic failures that had abandoned a decorated veteran to homelessness. The personal responsibility narrative collapsed under evidence of institutional abandonment. Patterson's address to Miguel was witnessed by everyone present. "Sergeant, you've been fighting this battle alone for too long. That ends today. The division takes care of its own, and you're coming home with me." The colonel's intervention was both rescue and indictment. Miguel was being reclaimed by military family, while civilian institutions were exposed for their failure to honor the service members who'd protected their freedom. Judge Blackwood's attempt to maintain authority was desperate and revealing. "Colonel, I appreciate your testimony, but this court cannot show favoritism based on military service. The law applies equally to everyone." Patterson's response was delivered with the authority of someone who'd earned his right to speak about service and sacrifice. "Your Honor, with respect, equal treatment would involve understanding that this man's condition results from wounds received defending the freedoms we enjoy in this courtroom. Criminalizing the consequences of his service isn't equal treatment, it's institutional betrayal. The breakthrough came when Patterson addressed the broader courtroom audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez didn't choose homelessness. It was forced on him by systems that failed to provide promised care. His presence in this courtroom represents our collective failure to honor those who've served with distinction. The community's response was immediate and transformative. Citizens who'd viewed Miguel as a criminal vagrant were forced to confront the reality that their comfortable lives had been protected by his sacrifice. The moral equation was inescapable. They owed him gratitude rather than judgment. The legal resolution was swift and complete. Judge Blackwood, faced with overwhelming evidence of Miguel's heroism and the community's shifting sympathy, dismissed all charges while mumbling about circumstances that weren't initially clear. His attempt to save face fooled no one. Patterson's final action was both practical and symbolic. Sergeant Rodriguez, you have quarters waiting at the division's transition facility, medical appointments scheduled at Walter Reed, and a benefits advocate who'll ensure you receive everything you've earned through your service. Miguel's response was emotional and overwhelming. 3 years of homelessness, addiction to survival, and systematic rejection dissolved into tears of relief and gratitude. The soldier who'd been forgotten by his country was being reclaimed by his military family. The courtroom cleared with unprecedented speed as civilians struggled to process their role in abandoning a war hero to homelessness. The comfortable assumptions about personal responsibility and worthy poverty had been shattered by evidence of institutional failure and systematic betrayal. Patterson's coordination with Miguel's recovery was immediate and comprehensive. Transportation to medical facilities, temporary housing, and benefits advocacy that would ensure his service-connected disabilities were properly treated rather than criminalized. The media attention was national and overwhelming. The story of a decorated veteran criminalized for homelessness while suffering from combat-related disabilities struck a nerve with Americans who'd proclaimed support for troops while ignoring veteran suffering. Judge Blackwood's position became untenable as his treatment of Miguel received national scrutiny. The video of his mockery, contrasted with Miguel's Bronze Star citation, became a symbol of civilian indifference to veteran sacrifice. His resignation was announced within a week. The broader impact extended throughout the justice system as courts nationwide examined their treatment of homeless veterans. Training programs were implemented, screening procedures were established, and veteran treatment courts were expanded to address the intersection of military service and civilian legal problems. Miguel's recovery was remarkable once he received appropriate medical care and institutional support. His traumatic brain injury symptoms improved with treatment. His PTSD was addressed through veteran-specific therapy, and his housing stability allowed him to rebuild relationships with family and community. The partnership between Patterson and Miguel evolved into a broader advocacy effort for homeless veterans throughout the military system. Their collaboration on veteran services policy reform and institutional accountability transformed personal rescue into systematic change. The Miguel Rodriguez case became a watershed moment in veteran advocacy and judicial reform that transformed how courts addressed homelessness, mental health, and military service. The immediate consequences included Judge Blackwood's resignation implementation of veteran screening procedures in Phoenix Municipal Court and mandatory training for judges on combat trauma and service-connected disabilities. The visual impact of Colonel Patterson confronting judicial indifference resonated nationwide, inspiring similar interventions by military leaders who'd watched their soldiers abandoned by civilian institutions. The story became a rallying point for veteran advocacy organizations seeking to bridge the civilian-military gap that had allowed systematic neglect of service members' needs. Miguel's transformation from homeless criminal to recognized hero demonstrated the power of institutional support and medical care in addressing veteran homelessness. His recovery became a model for comprehensive approaches that addressed underlying causes rather than criminalizing symptoms of untreated combat trauma and systemic abandonment. The legal precedent was significant and lasting. Courts nationwide implemented veteran identification procedures, established partnerships with VA medical centers, and created specialized dockets for cases involving service members. The Rodriguez Standard required judges to consider military service records and combat-related disabilities before imposing sentences that could exacerbate veteran suffering. The Phoenix Veterans Court was established within 6 months, providing specialized treatment for former service members whose legal problems stemmed from untreated combat trauma, substance abuse, or homelessness. The program's success rate exceeded 85%, demonstrating that therapeutic intervention was more effective than punitive processing for addressing veteran-related crimes. Miguel's advocacy work with Colonel Patterson influenced federal policy on veteran homelessness and criminal justice reform. Their testimony before congressional committees led to increased funding for veteran treatment courts, expanded mental health services, and improved coordination between civilian courts and military support systems. The cultural impact was equally profound. The story forced Americans to confront the disconnect between proclaimed support for troops and actual treatment of veterans facing crisis. The image of a decorated soldier being mocked by a judge who'd never served became a symbol of civilian responsibility for veteran welfare. The Colonel Patterson Protocol became standard practice for military leaders seeking to support former service members in civilian legal systems. The model emphasized respectful intervention, documentation of service records, and coordination with appropriate support services rather than confrontational advocacy that might damage civilian-military relations. Educational institutions incorporated the Rodriguez case into curricula on military-civilian relations, social justice, and the intersection of mental health and criminal justice. Law schools used the case to demonstrate how judicial prejudice could violate constitutional principles of equal protection and due process. Miguel's long-term recovery was complete and inspiring. He completed substance abuse treatment, obtained stable housing, and began working with veteran service organizations to help other homeless veterans navigate systems that had nearly destroyed him. His transformation from victim to advocate demonstrated the potential for recovery when appropriate support was provided. The universal message was clear. Military service creates obligations that extend beyond discharge. Veteran suffering represents institutional failure rather than personal weakness, and communities have moral responsibilities to those who've sacrificed for their protection. Miguel Rodriguez's story proved that recognition, respect, and appropriate support could transform lives while challenging systems that had abandoned those who deserved better treatment from the country they'd served with honor.